I want to welcome you to Anti-Racism Lab's speaker series for May. In case you don't know me, I'm Shirley Ann Tate. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and a Canada Research Chair in Feminism and Intersectionality. A brief land acknowledgement before I continue. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people, whose presence, histories, languages, and cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. I want to thank, first of all, our presiding elder, Elder Eliza Hillier, for her blessing, which will start very soon. I also want to thank Professor Tamari Kitossa for sharing his groundbreaking work with us today. I'm sure you'll all find it incredibly interesting and generative for discussion. So we hope you have some questions at the end of his talk as well. So I'll introduce Tamari after Elder Hillier's blessing, which is now. Over to you, Elder Hillier. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shirley. First of all, thank you for including me as the presiding elder in your interesting sessions, many different themes and issues. As a residential school survivor, I have a deep understanding of the blight of racism and the blatant disregard of the governments over minorities and the First Nations people. I come today to bless each and every one of you as you journey with your medicine wheels in your journeys to come together as brothers and sisters of the global family, and that racism, exclusion does not belong in our journeys. Creator, I humbly pray to you who have made all races to look kindly upon the global family. Take away the arrogance and hate which separates us from our sisters and brothers. May peacefulness and joy guide over our spirits as we journey together. Creator, we ask that you watch over us. Let divine light shine through us, that we become the beacons guiding those who are lost in racism and exclusion. Bless us that we can look forward to living in harmony together. Creator, give us the courage to listen with understanding and to speak our truths with boldness. May we project to others that the color of one's skin is less important than the spirit which resides within that person. Creator, you are the strength of our people. You lead us with our truths and our sacred medicine wheels. Our hearts beat the drums of life, and the beat moves us to sing together. Our kinship ties deepens. Bless us that our prayers and songs awaken brotherly love and a collective need for tranquility and peace. May you all have a wonderful day, a restful night, and may all your journeys be led with a divine light and your truths. Amen.
Thank you so much, Elder Hillier, for your wonderful words. Thank you. As always, we're so grateful to you for being a part of our journey. I want to thank also Manza, my wonderful graduate research assistant, Manza, for all of the coordinating and organizing work she has been doing the whole of the winter semester and into summer as well, and for today. Right, so let me introduce Tamari very briefly. I'm quite excited, as you can see, by what's to come. So you've seen anyway in the publicity, Dr. Tamari Kitossa is Professor of Sociology at Brock University. He earned his BA honors in Sociology and Political Science, wow, and Magisteriate degree at York University, Toronto, and his PhD at OIC, University of Toronto. His research and instructional interests include Blackness, anti-Blackness, Black masculinities, African Canadian leadership, anti-criminology, interesting, epistemology, and interracial unions. Thank you, Tamari. I'll just hand it over to you now.
You're on mute.
You're muted, Tamari.
Thank you. Yes, I want to thank you, Shirley-Ann, for the invitation. It's been a year in the making. You invited me last year, but I was not prepared. And I want to thank Manza for all the work that she's done in terms of coordinating behind the scenes. And I want to express my gratitude to Elder Hillier. Thank you for your kind words of welcome. I would like to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint slide I would like to go through. So, Manza, I'm gonna hit share now, and you just let me know if am I visible?
Yes, you are.
And the slide, yeah? Okay, great. Okay, great, thank you. So this is a work in progress that I've titled Self-Reporting on the Erotics of Anti-Black Misandry and Sexual Abuse, a work in progress. I want to first of all say that I really appreciate the invitation from Shirley-Ann, given that when I read her work, there is so much synergy in terms of the way that we're looking at issues around gender, race, sexuality. And also there are some, I would say, some productive and interesting divergences in our work. So I'm hoping that we can have some conversation about both the synergies and the divergences. And I look forward to the conversation with the audience members. Now, I've got 4 basic topics that I want to examine today or explore. As I pointed out, this is a work in progress, and I will explain why, in many respects, this is a work in progress, despite the fact that I'm pretty much at the point of saturation. And I wouldn't even say interview. I'm still working on the language. I've had conversation with 20 people thus far, and I've got a number more conversations lined up. And these are really conversations rather than interviews. And I think that's the way that I'm beginning to look at this work, which is an extension of the book that I curated, titled Appealing Because He's Appalling. So I'm really taken up with epistemic concerns at this point as I begin to look at the narratives of the folks that I've had conversations with, brilliant, generous people that have really opened my eyes to epistemic issues as well as analytic concerns. So I want to go through some epistemic issues. Then I want to talk a bit about theorizing the lives of Black men from, again, extending that conversation around epistemology, really to look at the politics of theory. And then I want to move into talking about Black men as erotic property and what I've called the empathy deficit disorder. And I want to use some concrete examples from strip searching and a concept called punitive penality, which is an idea developed by Richard Trexler on his work on sexuality and colonialism in the Americas. And then I'll present a few themes from the work in progress. And I will give a bit more explanation why I'm just talking in a very broad, overarching way about the themes, the major themes anyway, that have emerged at this point. Because part of what I'm dealing with right now is literally trying to develop a language to articulate in a very respectful way that honors the contributions of the folks that have had conversation with me. So let me just briefly go through my what I'm calling my epistemic concerns. The first is the scope of the project. I tend to base a lot of my epistemic preoccupations through the work of C. Wright Mills, a prominent US sociologist, and in particular his work, The Sociological Imagination. And one of the things that C. Wright Mills is trying to bring to our attention is that there is a preoccupation in sociology then, and it remains so the case now, of treating the problem of milieu in isolated instances. And he called this liberal practicality, right? So it is imagined that there is an amorphous mass of phenomena out there that are largely not connected. And then sociologists focus on one without endeavoring to look at that one as a fractal representation of the totality. And in that way, Mills is arguing that people can formulate policy recommendations and reforms because it does not even look at that one particular instance as a fractal of the totality. And increasingly, when I do my work, I'm trying to look at or take a very holistic approach. And I'll show you what that looks like when I talk about Neely Fuller and his identification or taxonomy of the 10 areas of people activity. And again, like I want to make it clear that while I was familiar with Neely Fuller previously, I never really thought about incorporating him into my scholarship and in my instruction in the classroom until one of the participants, one of the conversationalists that I spoke to, we had a really detailed and interesting conversation about Neely Fuller's ideas and how he mobilizes those ideas in his life. So the second issue is if we're looking at the scope, right, focusing on the scope of the project or any sociological research, right, where we're looking at one particular instance as a manifestation of the totality, meaning that it's a fractal, then we get into the issue of the propositions and the rules of formal logic for formulating theory. And here, I like to build and draw quite extensively on Alvin Goldner, who in The Coming Crisis of Sociology, he made it very explicit to sociologists that if you do not learn to use theory in a self-conscious way, you will be used by theory. And there's a way in which there's almost this preoccupation with data, as if data itself does not have principles and rules that govern it in terms of how they're even gathered. And so he's making the point that our theories and sentiments, they have a good deal to do with the career of a theory. And very often what we're required to do is to figure out what are the background assumptions embedded in theories and postulations so that we can be very clear about the postulations and the background assumptions behind the theory and the way in which we are approaching so-called data and evidence. And it's interesting, one of the things that he points out is that very often what we're dealing with is fit or sentiment, right? Sociologists, he points out, are not particularly good at explaining why a theory or proposition fits with them, feels good, right? He talks about sentiment and resonance. And so part of what I'm interested in doing is, as Goldner advises us, is to be very intentional and reflexive when we're doing our scholarship. The third concern for me is the function of theorizing and the purpose of research. Martin Nicholas has a wonderful essay called The Professional Organization of Sociology, A View from Below, where he makes the interesting observation that one of the things that sociologists are effectively doing is we are engaged in social espionage. Howard Becker talked quite a bit about the idea of whose side are we on and siding with the underdog. Martin Nicholas and Alvin Goldner caution us not to take the side of the underdog, but they argue for taking a stand
tends to be
ethical and principled.
So in my mind, I see that like the beginning of the terms, the first.
Tamari, sorry, I just muted all the participants just due to interference. So can you just quickly unmute yourself?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Right. Yeah, so Goldner and Martin Nicholas are asking us not to take a side. Rather, the idea is to take a stand on principles and a stance that is ethical. And this has vast implications for how we represent the perspectives, voices, and concerns of our conversationalists, which I'm referring to the folks that are involved in my project rather than participants, because I'm not making that distinction between myself and them, because there is no distinction between the observer and the observed. It's a part of a holistic dynamic. So again, this is really about articulating values and not taking sides or being involved in factions. This idea is something that Joyce Ladner, don't know why this is not. Sorry. Seem to be missing a slide. Anyway, so Joyce Ladner. So I'll talk a bit about Joyce Ladner. So Joyce Ladner was part of those conversations in the late 60s, early 1970s, where in her book, Tomorrow's Tomorrow, The Black Women, where she was beginning to question what role she plays as a sociologist in terms of examining the lives of Black girls and women. And what she realized is that she was participating in the sociological project as a proxy for the state to, in effect, to gather information about other people's lives and funnel that back to public policymakers and others in, that are managing the state. So one of the things that is quite important for me is to be quite intentional about developing a language for representing the voices and perspectives and the experiences of the conversationalists that have shared their social lives with me. Now, so moving from those epistemic concerns, I want to talk very briefly about apologias, the politics of knowledge, and what I'm calling the empathy deficit disorder. There is a tendency I have noted to apologize when folks, scholars, are examining or representing the lives of Black boys and Black men. And there's, for some reason, a necessity to apologize. And this raises, for me, an ethical concern around the capacity to recognize the life experience of Black boys and men without having to qualify it or apologize for the fact that in focusing on their lived reality, somehow this is represented or imagined as an exclusion of other people's lives. And so we can talk freely about women, Native Americans, First Nations, Métis in Canada, without having to say, but no, wait, we're not excluding anyone. So this comes back to Elder Hillier's point about exclusion. And again, to this issue for me of practicality, where to have a focus on the lives of Black boys and men should not presuppose that it needs to be qualified and apologized for in terms of the exclusion of others, because as I will demonstrate through social dominance theory and that there's an interdependence between all of us and that we're fractals of each other. even though the nature of that fractal representation is different. And I'm not persuaded that we need to qualify or apologize for any focus or emphasis on the lives of Black boys and men. Now, again, to this issue of the scope of how I'm approaching my research, Neely Fuller, I think, is a really an insightful scholar, a scholar in every stretch of the imagination, though outside of the academy. He identifies that there are 10 areas of people activity. And one of those areas, which is number 4, which is health, his mentee, oh my goodness, Frances Cress Welsing, she contributed that to this taxonomy, which previously there were 9. So there's economics, education, entertainment, health, labor, law, politics, sex, religion, and war. The reason why I have sex identified or emphasized is that I'm looking at sex as that fractal space, that fractal modality, that fractal moment in which all of the other areas of people activity are represented, right? And so I will talk a bit more about what that looks like for Black men in terms of sex in and of itself, but we're going to be able to see that this has vast implications for economics, education, and health and labor when I talk a bit about some of the perspectives shared with me by the research conversationalists. Now, if we enter the study of Black boys and men, there are a number of works, both social philosophers in the academy and outside of it, that have made vital contributions that are really informative for my work, and also for what Tommy Curry has identified as Black male studies. Although I do not personally like to use Black male studies, I don't use it because it's mimetically, how does one make a distinction between Black male and Black male, M-A-I-L versus M-A-L-E? So I tend to identify it as the studies of Black boys and men. So of course, there's Frantz Fanon, James Baldwin, which were central for me in appealing because he's appalling. But there are other scholars, such as Robert Staples, and intellectuals such as Ishmael Reed, Hakeem Madhubuti, Earl Afari Hutchinson, and Nathan McCall, whose fantastic book makes me want to holler. These social philosophers and scholars, they laid the groundwork for scholars such as Tommy Curry, T. Hassan Johnson, who are doing absolutely fantastic work in developing a really solid foundation for the study of Black boys and men. And I want to give a nod in particular to Tommy Curry and Hassan Johnson. I'll talk a bit more about some of Hassan's contributions, where Tommy in particular talks about the focus, or when we tend to see research on Black boys and men, it tends to be represented through a genre, right? So there's a genre of Black boys and men rather than Black boys and men as gender. And here he's suggesting that we're looking at a archetype or stereotype of Black boys and men that is meant to be that all-encompassing framework that we load the complexity of Black boys and men's lived experience across the Western world, Africa, and elsewhere into that box of the genre. And Tommy is really doing a fantastic job of like opening that up so that we can get to see the lives of Black boys and men in a much more complex and complicated way. Hassan Johnson is another scholar in the United States that is, I think, a really vital contributor, along with Tommy Curry and others, that is enabling us to theorize the lives of Black boys and men in much more complicated ways. So I'll get to T. Hassan Johnson in a moment. What I want to focus on now is the issue of theorizing, right? How do we theorize the lives of Black boys and men if the standard frame of reference imagines them as a genre, and typically that genre is a deficit or pathologizing genre? What do we use? And when I say we, I'm including myself here. I've been, thinking quite hard about what theoretical perspectives enable me to examine in a broad scope way the lives and the lived experiences of Black boys and men. And for me, I'm not persuaded that the theory of intersectionality is helpful, because intersectionality presupposes at base the individual in that geometry that you see there on the left of your screen. That individual is a woman, is a female, is a girl. And that's what it presupposes, right? And so always the substrate, the subtext for intersectionality is the feminine. I'm not persuaded at all that that is useful for me to theorize the lives of Black boys and men when it's being jammed into a theoretical approach or perspective that inherently presupposes that Black men are patriarchs, that they're masculinists, and all the negative tropes that are associated with quote unquote toxic masculinity. Interlocking oppressions. This too is, I think, a fairly static way, although it's an older way than intersectionality, which in some ways builds on double and triple jeopardy. Interlocking oppressions is also quite static, but if you dig deep enough into the work of scholars that use interlocking oppression, you will also find that we're dealing with a feminine subjectivity as the root of interlocking oppressions. So I'm interested in moving beyond those approaches and perspectives, because to me, in as much as the lived experience of Black boys and men is as much intersecting as that of Black women, I just when I read the work of those that are doing intersectional analysis, and even Dr. Mutua at University of Buffalo, who's trying to expand and rethink intersectionality, I'm not persuaded that one can actually do that and still have the theory not radically being transformed in ways that that maybe those invested in feminist scholarship are prepared to entertain. Here, for example, is T. Hassan Johnson. What he's done is that he's reproduced some data for the Center in the United States for National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. And what he shows, what is shown through this empirical data, is that there's something happening. That when you look at the misery index in all categories, empirical categories, except that which is gynecological, African-American males are worse off than African-American females, girls and women, right? And other than gynecological issues. Intersectionality cannot explain this. Interlocking oppression cannot explain this. We need something else in order to do this. So I'm going to share this slide with Dr. Tate so she can upload it with the recorded lecture. So when you go to the data also for African-American males, when you do the comparison, again, you'll see that like on the misery index, African-American males exceed those of African-American females. This ought not to be taken in a competitive way. There's got to be a way to explain it without saying that as a that there's some sort of moral sanctimonious basis for why the experience of Black boys and men should be emphasized over that of Black women. It cannot be emphasized over because the experiences are interdependent. And I think that's the language that Tommy Curry and T. Hassan Johnson and others who are expanding the study of Black boys and men in the United States, that is the perspective that they're coming from. And I'll elaborate that in a moment now when I talk about social dominance theory and the subordinate male target hypothesis, which owes quite a bit to Jim Sidanius, the late Jim Sidanius from, I think it's I think Sedamus was at Stanford or Yale. I cannot now remember which one. So it's a pretty, it can be a fairly complex model, right? But what he's pointing out is that there are three standard sites of social power. First, age. Those who are elders or older tend to have more power than those who are younger. Then there is the gender sex criteria. It is argued that in this category, males have more power than females. And in the arbitrary set category, when you look at all of those criteria that I have there for what may be considered arbitrary, they are literally arbitrary. Those are the arbitrary sites of domination. Now, I do question the gender sex site of power in that it is one size fits all again. So even those people that are arguing from social dominance theory, right, they may be contradicting themselves in their own theory. By then, when you look at the subordinate male target hypothesis, which is indicating that males from the out group are not equal in power to females of the in group, and in a number of instances do not have equivalent power to females of the out group also. So there's a way in which social dominance theory itself is internally contradictory, but I think it gives us a way of looking at the lived experiences of Black men and Black women in an interdependent way. Why is that? The subordinate male target hypothesis argues that the fundamental way to dominate any outgroup, you must first dominate and subordinate the males. Think of transatlantic slavery. Of all the people trafficked across the Atlantic, 2/3 were males. This is information that is readily available, right? But it's often not spoken about. So how do we get 2/3 of all those trafficked across the Atlantic being male, and we don't have a conversation about that? How do we not have a conversation, let's say in the city of Toronto, where the ratio of Black men to Black women is 79 men for every 100 women? What are the implications for social relations, the formation of families, and the transfer of intergenerational wealth when historically the income gap between males, both in-group and out-group, is always greater within the genders? So the disparity of income between Black men and white men, right, is greater than the disparity between the income between Black women and white women. This has vast implications for intergenerational wealth. And we can go back to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1920, talking about in his essay, The Damnation of Woman, where he actually points out that the income disparity between Black men and white men is so vast that becomes the principal explanation to explain why there is lack of intergenerational wealth between Black people and white people in the United States. So let me move on now to Black men as erotic property and what I'm calling the empathy deficit disorder. So the idea of erotic property, this is a concept that I've derived from Randall Collins in his book, Non-Obvious Sociology. It's an interesting concept, but he offers no racial explanation in terms of how it might work. I'm adopting it and adapting it. He's using it in the context of the immediacy of the gift giving and exchange within an intimate union. And I want to focus just very briefly on strip searching and Richard Trexler's concept of punitive penalty. In Ontario, in 2019, the Office of the Independent Review of Police Director discovered that across Ontario when they did their study, which is 2018, they found that 22,000 strip searches were conducted annually by police across Ontario, with the greatest proportion in the city of Toronto. Now, one of the interesting things that they did in their study when they published it is they gave the statistics for women. They didn't give the statistics for men. They said 20 to 25% of all persons strip searched of the 22,000 were women. They never specifically identified males. And here again, I'm trying to emphasize a point that moral chivalry, this idea that the interests of women should be protected over that of men, which is what social dominance theory in fact argues, is literally manifest in the study. They don't actually tell us. Using those statistics, that 75 to 80% of all those who were strip searched in Ontario are males. Now, what are the implications of that in the city of Toronto? In the Human Rights Commission report conducted by Scott Wortley at the University of Toronto, that report titled "A Disparate Impact," second interim report on the inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black persons by the Toronto Police Service, what they found is that 4% of the city's population, which are Black men, represent 25% of all sexual assault complaints against Metro Toronto Police. That is quite significant. How do you get 4% of the population, which are males, filing 25% of all sexual assault complaints against the Metro Toronto Police? That ought not to be the case if we assume that gender equals woman means that women are more subject to sexual exploitation and victimization by the state. But this is not so the case in Toronto. Now, what this means is that we need to then have a way of thinking about what Baldwin and Fanon emphasize, which is that we need to look at the way in which the bodies of Black boys and men are sexualized. Black men and boys are imagined to be hypersexual. They're always seen to be wanting sex. They're seen to be held to be in suspicion of rape. I'll give you a couple of stories to show what this looked like in my case. I think it was about 2014. I can't remember the exact date. A white female student, came to my class, to my office hours, and because I keep my doors open, because I'm cautious about that. This white female student broke down and started to sob and cry in my office hours, a fourth-year student. And I thought, I couldn't figure out why the student was crying, but I was terrified that my peers would walk by, think that I was doing something to the student. And I said to her very calmly, like, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "I have not, this is the first time that I've ever been this close to a Black man." So, yeah, I don't know why I'm tearing up over this. Yeah, this student in my office was actually terrified of me. And I said, like, where did you get this idea from? And she said, in my small town in Ontario, when we watch the news, what we see is Black men are dangerous. They're rapists, they're criminals, and they're threatening. So this is how Black men and boys are represented in the popular culture. This has quite significant resonances for thinking about strip searching and looking at the lives of Black men, not only in Toronto, and here's one particular instance where police officers not simply strip searched a man, but they pulled down his pants in public. And I want to emphasize again that the rule on strip searching put forward by the Supreme Court of Canada based on the case of R versus Golden is in fact based on the strip searching of a Black man in the city of Toronto. And they formulated the rules for strip searching based on the strip searching of a Black man. We can go to the UK, where Shirley is. There, last year, and maybe like a year and a half ago, there was a significant public protest against the strip searching of children in the public education system in the metropolitan London area. What was the reason for the public protest? It turned out that a Black girl was strip searched by the police. And this is called the Child Q scandal. A 13-year-old Black girl was strip searched. When you read deeper into the literature, what you find is that 95% of the boys that have been, of the people that have been strip searched, of the youth that have been strip searched, have been boys. And the percentage that are Black boys, I think it is 38%. For some reason, I cannot see on my slide here, but I think the 38% is for Black boys. So all the time, boys have been strip searched, and something like 38% of them have been Black boys, but yet there's been no public attention to it, meaning that the strip searching of Black boys is being normalized. What are the harms that this is causing? What are the implications for Black boys in terms of how they imagine themselves and how they imagine those in authority who have legal remit literally to sexually assault them? We know about punitive penalty from a number of instances. The Abner Louima case in the United States in the 1990s was a prominent one. In 2017, French police officers were charged with anally raping a community activist, an African male. And more recently, just last year in 2023, two officers of the Richland Police Department in Mississippi were implicated in the shooting, beating, and the sexual torture of two African-American young men. And again, the preoccupation is on the genitalia, and where they can do it, they engage in what's called penetrative penality, right? Literally, the orifices of Black men are penetrated by those in positions of power and authority. I know very well what it feels like to be frisked and stopped and searched by police, and to have a police officer's hands all over my genitals, and that this is standard. And so when people say that racial profiling works, stop and search works, what we're doing is we're in fact legitimizing the history of the sexual assault and the preoccupation with the genitalia of Black men and boys. So let me turn now to this work in progress that I'm working on. So the project is titled Black Men's Sexual Tropes, Trauma, and Resilience, a transnational portrait of erotic racism, sexual stereotypes, and Black men's lives. In the book, what I did was I developed the concept of the Black phallic fantastic, which is a myth. The mythology is that Black men are hypersexual. They're priapic, meaning that they're supposed to have large penises. And the other trope is that they have a high propensity to commit rape. Again, I have personal stories with this. I had this one time a mixed race student, Black and white mixed race. She came to my office to express her frustration with a situation that she had with her white female peers, her best friends. They went out to a nightclub in downtown St. Catharines, and her friends were saying to her, we have to really be careful with each other because the Black guys at the club are going to rape us. And she just could not fathom that this is how her white female friends were looking at Black men, right? One of whom was her brother. So she couldn't process this. So this is something that is like active in the lived experience of also Black women. And I'll talk very briefly about the impact of that shared with me by some of the Black women that I interviewed. So very briefly, I'm going to be very cautious about how I talk about what was shared with me by some of the research participants. And there's some topics that I'm not going to elaborate in too much detail because I haven't quite figured out a way yet how to narrate that. And I'll come to this issue of language because that was a big issue with all of the research participants, especially the men that I spoke to. One theme that is constant among all the men that I spoke to is literally, can we talk? They literally do not have anyone to speak to about these issues, and they were quite eager to participate in the research project because they told me that, like, I don't have anyone to talk to about, about being abused as a child, about being manipulated as an adult, about being treated as if I'm a sexual threat, about being treated in the workplace as if I am other people's erotic property. They say, like, we don't have a language for it. They literally don't know how to talk about it because they don't have a language for it. And that's one of the, I think, important epistemological contributions, I think, for this project is to mobilize the narratives of the men to help us to figure out how to develop a language that respects the capacity of Black men to develop a language to talk about their experience without having to make apologies for doing so. Impression management and the politics of control. This issue is one that was really resonant among all the men that I spoke to. Many were, particularly those that worked in professional settings, they dressed themselves to the nines, suit and tie, and all the rest. They had to make sure to manage the impression that they were not erotic beings and that they were not interested in sex. And so this is through the professionalization of representation, that's how these men actually managed the image of themselves, which they quite keenly understood is reproduced through media. A lot talked about slavery as one of the conduits of that narrative of Black men as hypersexualized beings, and that Black men are erotically out of control. And so many of the men, particularly those in professional settings, they were almost neurotic about managing their impressions such that no one can make any accusations or even think that they were giving off a vibe of sexuality. A third theme is negotiating their status as erotic property. This, I found this quite painful. And I'll talk about two men in particular. One is a government employee. And he talked to me about being in the workplace, how he's sexualized by both white women and white men. His body is not his own. The white women in the workplace grope his rear end and tap his bum. And they make comments such as, I bet you can do it really good. And you probably got a big one. These are things that are said to him in the workplace, right? On the other hand, he's had situations where white men in the workplace have propositioned him to have sex with their wives. This is called cuckolding. And so he's had to navigate a situation where he cannot file complaints of sexual harassment in the workplace because for him, he has to grin and bear it because he regards his presence in the offices in which he works as an act of service to other Black people, both men and women, who would come after him to work in those offices. So he cannot afford to file human rights complaints or complaints of sexual harassment because he has a reasonable assumption that that would spoil the opportunity for other Black people coming after him. So he imagines that he's at the front edge of opening up space and that he quite literally has to live with being the erotic property of others. Another troubling situation that was shared with me was with a Black man that was in the hospital for a medical situation. And while under the influence of narcotics, a nurse propositioned him for sex, and he did not feel he could refuse because he was vulnerable and that she was in charge of his medical care. And so he felt that he had to submit to the sexual advances of the nurse, and in fact, right, participated in sexual intercourse in the hospital room. And he has to suppress this. This cannot be disclosed to management. He could not have disclosed this to management in the hospital. Again, the feeling and the fear is that he would either be wrongly accused or it would open up space for other Black men coming into the hospital not to receive adequate and fair medical treatment. Another issue was sexual threats, manipulation, and assault in adulthood. There's a growing body of scholarship now, the last 15 years or so, which is beginning to look at women as sexual predators. And it's interesting talking to men about how they narrate that, what quote unquote experience of being sexually abused. And I'll talk about the example of both men from the African continent, men from the Caribbean, and men from Canada. These men had been initiated into early onset sexuality. Most of the men thus far have talked about women, older girls and women initiating them. And they have all described it as an experience. And with each one of those men, I said to them, you know, wait a minute, can you really say that you had an experience when you were 8, when you were 12, and the woman was 19 or the woman was 30? Can you call that an experience? And they said, no, really, when you think about it, no, we can't. And I said, well, what other language can you use? And like all of the men were stumped. We could not actually come up with a language to articulate what that might look like. Part of it is that the men did not see themselves as victims. They did not see themselves as survivors. Many, in fact, wanted to protect the women who had sexually abused and sexually assaulted them in particular, but they also wanted to protect women in the abstract, right? They did not want to, you know, give vent to the idea that women are or can be sexual predators. And so this is really difficult for the men that I spoke to, and they were actually really emotionally conflicted in terms of even talking about it and then developing a language around it. The sixth issue that I encountered, or a theme, is the impossible language and the implications for intimacy. And here I'm going to be very careful. I spoke to a number of men, and in fact, one man introduced me to the idea of emotional incest. Until I spoke to him, I had not the slightest clue that there was something called emotional incest. And he explained it to me, and I've been looking at it in the literature. And it is where sons and boys are positioned in a spousal-like relationship with mothers and older women. And the men who talked about this, they talked about the difficulty they have in trusting women, and that their lead time for trusting any woman, it's a couple of years well. And it's really difficult for them to trust women. And so their intimate relationships with women is very complicated, and they're very guarded. And I thought that was a really interesting theme that emerged in a number of instances. And again, the impossibility of formulating a language around it. And that speaks to the issue of what Laura Sjoberg, in her book, Women as Wartime Rapists, she calls it the impossible woman. So at this point in the social sciences, we're actually struggling to develop a language around this that does not pathologize women and women that are involved in, even I have difficulty using the language of sexual predator. I think it's highly problematic that women who intervene in the sovereignty and the autonomy of others, we're still working to develop a language around that. And I'm very guarded about speaking about it much more than that, and in any further detail. Excuse me. And finally, no, not finally, I have one more slide after this. Now, I also spoke to women And the reason why is it's important, I thought, to speak to not only women that are the spouses of men, because there's space to speak to the male spouses of Black men, but it's women thus far that have approached me, and the snowballing has found women spouses who are interested to participate in the project. In a number of instances, the women are very conscious and aware that they are impacted by the erotic property status of Black men. And I've had, of the 10 Black women that I spoke to, I'd say about 40%, 4 of them, spoke about random conversations with white women, where white women would simply strike up conversation and let them know that they're interested in dating Black men and that they date Black men, and that they begin to talk about the stereotypes of Black men as if the Black woman invited this conversation. So the erotic property of Black men is literally transferred onto Black women in those instances where the Black women themselves are not asked if they want to consent in these sorts of conversations. And this is, the Black women found this to be quite troubling and problematic. And they found it also emotionally scarring, as much as the Black men did in talking about how they're sexualized. The women that were mothers that are involved in this project, they each spoke about the concern of navigating the potential for false accusations of physical and sexual impropriety directed at their sons in primary, middle, and high school. And there were mothers whose sons were subjected to those sorts of accusations in a number of instances that were consensual, and were it not for teachers and other adults who came to the rescue of their sons would have been falsely accused of violating the sexual autonomy of the girls in question. And the mothers found it quite troubling. And so, as with the fathers that I spoke to, the mothers are very conscientious about having conversation with their sons. So the talk, the talk about police in Black families, for a number of the research participants, the talk is also about managing your sexual impressions, managing the situations that you're in so that you're not accused of any sexual impropriety. And if you engage in consensual sex, that you recognize that the female or the girl also needs your consent. And this is one of the interesting ways that both mothers and fathers are helping to prepare their sons for the ways in which Black boys and men are imagined as erotic property. Now, the final theme that I want to briefly touch on is every single woman that I spoke to, right? Empathy was a core reason for why they participated in the project, because they argue that they are empathetic toward Black men. I had 2 of the 10 women that are quite steeped in feminist literature, but they do not define themselves as feminists. The majority, the overwhelming majority of the women involved in the project describe themselves as non-feminists. And I can't quite figure out why it is the case thus far that women attracted to participating in the project are either not feminists or women who have a comprehension of feminism, but it doesn't totally resonate with them. So there's something interesting going on there, and that requires a bit more analysis and examination. And finally, for future conversations, a key issue that I'll be focusing on as I move on in talking to other, inviting conversations with other people to be part of the project is I have a number of conversations scheduled with counselors and therapists. And informally, what I'm hearing from counselors and therapists is that the Black men in their practice that are with whom they are delivering services, what they're finding is that the issue of erotic property, the construction of Black men as erotic property, that Black men have been subjected to sexual abuse as children, and that as adults, they're narrating that they have been subjected to um, um, manipulation and other such behaviors, that this is something that they're working through in their practices with Black men, and that it is becoming an increasingly open topic of conversation. So the practical aspect of this project is I don't want to simply lay bare the experiences and the narratives of the conversationalists that are in the project. I also want to talk about what are the practical steps that Black men can use to navigate their experience in the world as the erotic property of others. How can mothers and fathers have more and better conversation with their sons about sex and sexuality? And how can counselors and therapists themselves, right, mobilize strategies and practices beyond talk therapy? Because what we know of the speech centers of the brain is that it is larger in women. Women have a greater capacity for emotional expression, articulation, and language than males do. And the informal conversations that I've had with therapists and counselors is that they're quite interested in using somatic modalities to help men tap into the trauma of particularly sexual assault and abuse, and how they might work that through so that they can develop healthier relationships toward themselves, sexuality, and their intimate relationships with their loved ones. So I will leave it there. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing the screen.
I want to thank you for that incredibly generative, but also at the same time moving talk of your work in progress, Tamari. I just want to engage with a few ideas with you before we go to questions from the audience. So audience members, get your questions ready, please, because you'll be asked to unmute your mic and ask your question directly. Right, Manza? Yeah. I think that your work really resonates clearly with Tommy Curry's work as well, even though you don't do Black male studies, and I understand why you would say that in terms of your take on like intersectionality, why it doesn't fit with thinking about Black men's lives. I understand all of that really well. I wanted to just take up two questions of methods for people in the audience who might be PhD students or people thinking about what they need to do in terms of method. And then ask you about erotic property a little bit more, I think, and something on Fanon and Baldwin. But if I'm going to take up too much space, I'll like chop it down a bit. I was really interested in the fact that you said you have conversationalists and you have conversations and not interviews. I wondered if you could say something about why that was important for you, have conversations and not interviews.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think part of it reflects my own personal journey at this moment in life, where I'm beginning to think much more intentionally about spirituality and thinking about why so much of what I have been trained to do as a sociologist has no capacity for the spirit and that spiritual aspect of ourselves. And Alvin Goldner is one of the people that really drew my attention to that, where he talks about resonance, right? Why does a concept resonate? That's not because it's a rational explanation for why it resonates. There's something kinetic, right? That resonates with our experience as a being. And that's how I'm beginning to think, or beginning to think about scholarship, right? Not just phenomenologically, but spiritually. And that means that when I have conversations with people, I am not an interrogator. This is not an inquisition. I'm learning as much about myself through this interview, through this conversation, through this process, as the conversationalists are learning about themselves and me. And this is why I'm finding the conversations with the conversationalists so incredibly enriching, and why I feel so charged to be responsible and accountable for representing their reality, their perspective. It's not, I'm not simply representing them. I'm also enmeshed in the representation, and that there's some ways that I can delink them for analytical purposes, but it's also trying to find a language to be able to do that. And that's one of my struggles as an epistemologist at this point in time, is to actually find that language. So for me, it's a process. And it's something that I'm working on for that reason.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you kind of like a connected question to that, because I, like you, like do conversations. That's how I see, you know, the kind of data gathering, if you want to call it, work that I do, because I think it's much more important to engage with people rather than to have a list of questions. But I wanted to ask you, because you're actually also talking about yourself. You're also a Black man doing this work. And, you know, for me, I could feel a lot of emotion coming from you as you were talking, especially about your experiences with students as well. And I wondered how you deal with the affective charge that remains with you after the conversations, just again for people who might be doing similarly affecting work. How do you deal with those emotions? Oh, you didn't hear me? You didn't hear?
It got cut off just a little bit, yes.
Okay. I'm wondering how you deal, yourself, Tamari, not necessarily the research, but Tamari, how do you deal with the affective charge that you carry with you after the interview? Something, again, for people who might be doing, you know, similarly affecting work.
Again, another like fantastic question. Let me just share this with you. When I started doing the interviews, I was very mechanical. I would schedule 2 interviews in one day. And after the second time of doing that, my body was telling me, Tamari, don't do this. You actually cannot handle this.
Yeah.
I would literally be my body would go comatose for about 72 hours. And that's when I realized, oh, hey, man, this is not something to play with. You're not doing standard scholarship where you ask a bunch of questions, get people's perspectives and narratives, write it down, write it up, and say, this is what I discovered. People's energy is being transferred to me. We're sharing something, we're building something. And in honoring that, I have come to the realization that in order for me to do my work well, to be myself well, I need to mobilize somatic therapies and approaches that help me to prepare myself for future conversations and to help me to develop the capacity to be reflexive when I'm reading the transcripts. So there's a lot of meditation, a lot of deep breathing, and a lot of conversation with my friends, my spouse, and my children. Because who I am when I leave those conversations is leaking out onto them also.
Yes.
Right? So there are these ways in which somatically my spiritual self is being invested. And so I'm developing these somatic and these spiritual modalities that draw on ancient traditions of prayer, contemplation, yoga, and breathing.
Thank you so much. That's really important to hear, because I know carrying the emotion of others with you into life, as you say, it leaks out, is something that can't be denied, because we don't do research that, as you say, it's about adding numbers or something. It's with people, and people emote. I have one last question, if you will allow me, before I get the audience members to come in. And that's to do with, because you were saying developing a language is important. And I agree, developing a language to talk about such themes as you're unfolding in your research, really important and significant, I have to say. But I was thinking about policy, because you mentioned at the beginning that, and I wondered how you can avoid the kind of policy capture that happens when you do research that is funded federally. I don't know. I just want some tips myself.
Yeah, you know what? Again, another brilliant question, because these are thoughts that I'm working through, and I don't know how successful I will be, because when I look at sociology, sociologists themselves have not been successful. It seems as if sociologists have dropped those conversations that were really quite animating around phenomenology and ontology in the 70s, late 60s, early into the late 70s and early 80s. I'm not certain the sociologists have come to terms with that. And maybe that's part of the issue, is I'm reading others to try to find the language, but I'm not certain that sometimes words that we have, that we use, can enable us to do that kind of work. And so for me, it involves being humble about my capacity to be able to represent something that might not be representable by words. And this means that we can never prevent policy capture, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not responsible for how someone takes up any work that I do. I'm responsible for the production of the work itself, and it will take its own life. And if people have integrity, honesty, and they approach the work from the vantage point of themselves, somatically, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, then whatever is drawn upon that sort of work produced from that vantage point by policy, it can only be good.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Tamari. Okay, audience members, would you like to ask any questions? Just unmute your mic and go. You're still thinking. Okay, I'll continue then, because I'm enjoying this discussion. Prof. Collins is coming in. Go on, Prof. Collins.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kitossa, for that really engaging talk. I think just listening to you, it just brought back lots of stories and experiences that I have also had, not just as a graduate student, but now as a faculty member. As a matter of fact, I met with a retired faculty member a few months ago, and a Black man. And one of the first pieces of advice that he gave me was never close the door when you're meeting a student, you know. And I knew that already, but that was one of the first things that he said to me. Just listening to you, I wanted to ask you about the role of because this idea of this black male sexual promiscuity and so on, it's so resonant and it's so strong. Just last year I attended a comedy event, and it was all like just African comedians from all over the continent, and I realized that 90% of the jokes that were told at that event were about Black men and something related to sexuality. And those jokes seem to evoke, you know, the biggest reactions. It was a really pretty multi-racial, multi-ethnic crowd. And after the event, you know, I was sort of having a conversation with a few friends, and my friend, who was a Black woman, actually took the biggest issue with it and said this was, whereas a few of us who, you know, Black men were like, well, you know, how do we compartmentalize, and, you know, like, is there a space for us to laugh at these while also understanding that this is there's a problematic, you know, context in which these jokes are being received and so on. So I really wanted to ask you about, and that theme is so strong, particularly amongst, you know, Black comedians, and I'm kind of interested in the interplay between structure and agency here. Is this a case of, you know, taking our trauma and turning it into and making, you know, and kind of not really making light of trauma, but making the best out of trauma in the way that we often do with a lot of other issues and stereotypes? Or is there a deeper problematic aspect to this that we should be aware of and sort of, you know, kick against? You know, I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yes, it does make a lot of sense, and it's a brilliant question because it comes back to the questions that Shirley and I were discussing earlier around what is the role of the theorist? How do you do your work in terms of its methods? You know, I think I tend to think about this from the vantage point of what Dave Chappelle talked about. Dave Chappelle walked away from the Chappelle Show when he realized at a certain point, when he was with the team pitching jokes, he pitched a particular joke, and one of the white team members, one of the white writers, laughed. And Dave said, the laugh was not a laughter at the joke, but a laugh at him. And that's the moment when he realized, oh, something is not working for me. And I think this is that moment where, you know, that quote unquote come to Jesus moment, where every scholar, every comedian, every person who engages conversation in ways that reproduce these tropes, that they have to have that moment when they realize that the laundering of their trauma through humor may be at their own personal expense, and that they need to figure out for themselves what are the ways that they can develop a language to navigate that experience without filling an already overflowing cup of sexual tropes. And I realized that that might not be the sort of answer that offers a structural explanation. And part of it is that I'm not a structuralist, right? I think we only have relationships. We don't have structure. We only have relationships with each other bound by authority and power, and that those relationships of authority and power need not be hierarchical. They could be lateral also. And that's when we have that moment with each other, where as the comedian with their audience, with me as a writer and scholar with my audience, leveling that field where we can have a conversation where I am being laid bare in my own trauma, not imposing it on anyone, not working it out on anyone, but it being part of a dynamic conversation. And so again, thanks, Prof. Collins. I suspect that my response may not offer the kind of structural explanation, but you know, that's just how I come at it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Any other questions from the audience? Please feel
Yes,
free to.
Shirley.
Yes, go.
Hopefully my background isn't too loud. I'm in a coffee shop. So thank you for your talk, Dr. Kitossa. I'm just curious to know, as part of your dissemination plan for this work, do you plan to write a paper about methodology and methods? Because I'm going back to your points about actually a question that was raised by one of the people that you had a conversation with about where can I go to have these conversations. And I've been thinking about research as a mode of repair. I'm actually working on something with a colleague because of my own experiences in conversations where, you know, I was doing an interview and it was with a woman who broke down, and I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, maybe we can reschedule." She's like, "No, this is actually what I need. You know, thank you for creating this space." So it was like the conversation was, I guess, somewhat healing. That's how she described it. And in other work that I've done in partnership with some colleagues, some of the community members that we worked with in building, this is public knowledge, building the Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement in the TDSB, the community members were like, "We need this space. Thank you so much. I know you all are doing research, but thank you for curating this kind of environment." So, you know, how are you thinking through that?
Yeah,
in your own work?
thanks for that question. The short of the long answer is I continue to think it through. And one of the reason why I answer in that way is I'm very mindful of what I have read about doing methods and methodology, that the researcher, and me quite specifically, I need to be mindful that I'm not working my shit out on other people. This is not an opportunity for me to do self-therapy, right? And I think that's how I'm coming at it. And, you know, as you talk about writing a paper on methods, yeah, this is something that I'm hoping that I will be able to do, and do it in a way or at a time when, even if I don't have the language just right, I'm not certain that I need to wait to figure out what the language is to be able to share this with the research community. I think what I need to do, though, is to be much more present about myself, right? In terms of my own somatic, spiritual, and energetic practices, such that I could bring that to a research paper to explain to others my journey, and that it's individualistic. It'll be like each person has their own journey, but then also to articulate that when you do your research and you go through your journey, that resonates with other people. You're actually expanding and expanding their energetic domain, and others will, like, in terms of morphic resonance, quite literally, right? You're literally helping to be a part of a transformation of the morphogenic field. And that is quite cathartic. And as you point out, for your research, put in quote, participants, but also for yourself, because you're involved in a conversation about morphogenesis. Because as you well know from Dudley Laws, our dearly departed brother some years ago, he said, like, we've been researched to death. I think this is the next step for all of us in academia, is to come to that moment when we can figure out who we are by doing research and why we're doing the research. Yes, I'm being paid. Yes, policymakers will take and do with it what they will, but it's to generate the research itself from a vantage point of humility, honesty, and like a agape, a hard love, where you ask yourself hard questions as much as the people that you're having conversation with, that they should be ready for those hard questions, and that they too will ask you hard questions. So thank you for the question. That too, for me, is a work in progress.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Giselle. Thanks, Tamari. Anyone else from the audience with a question? Just jump in.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor. This is really great talk. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciated your methodology and how you approach the research. I'm a graduate student and doing close to finishing my PhD, and I really sort of struggled when I was interviewing my research participants because I had to keep in mind my committee and how people thought about the methodology that I was using. But at the same time, I was working with a very vulnerable population, and it was important that I conducted the research in a way that was ethical to me, and a sort of ethical to me, and respected people's time and what they were sharing. So I really appreciate that. My question, I'm not even sure if it's a question, but really when you were speaking about young men engaging in sexual activity with older women, years ago, I worked with a different group of high school students, and some of the young men, well, not some, just two, and I had a friend of mine who shared similar experience of engaging in sexual intercourse with older women when they were really young. We're talking about 13 to maybe 14, 15, 16, around that age. And they didn't see it as sort of sexual assault or rape, even though these were like one of the young men, it was a woman who was actually babysitting him. His mother like left him with her, and she was a much older woman in, I think, in her 40s or 30s. I'm not exactly sure, but as I was trying to talk with him about the incident, he didn't see it as rape, and actually felt kind of proud speaking about it, as if someone who's very young was able to have sexual interaction or the attention of an older woman. And that kind of it's challenging to have those conversations with young men. I'm just thinking about some of your thoughts and maybe on that, or how your research participant sort of viewed that. I know you spoke to it a little bit. So thank you so much again.
Thank you for that. So Tommy Curry has a brilliant essay. It's called, I think it's called She Touched Me, where he interviewed five Black men, about their, and again, I'm being careful with the language, early onset initiation into sexual activity. And one of the startling things is the constant use of the word experience. I think part of what we're dealing with is there's a capture of the language, the content of experience in ways that do not resonate with men in terms of their capacity to survive the experience. Again, I'm putting quotations experience. The reason why, and one particular man that I spoke to, which was, and his experience resonates with the research that Tommy did, is that in his instance, he was 13, the woman was 35, he had no clue what sex was all about. He was curious about a woman's body, but it terrified him simultaneously because something didn't seem right to him. And it is through having the conversation with me, the conversation that we had, that he was able to, in a moment, recognize that one of the reasons why, when he has sex with women, his spouse, there's a smell, there's an odor of sex that populates his olfactory senses, which is not physically present. And part of it is to be able to create space to question whether that should be constructed as an experience, because it is disabling this particular man's experience to be intimate and in the moment. And that's when he realized, holy shit, it's not an experience. Something else needs to be, some other word needs to be used to identify it. And I think as a culture, we're just at the cusp of that, as I pointed out, with the body of research that is growing around women. violating the sovereignty and the autonomy of boys and men. But I think one of the things that is helping the conversation along is there is a large number of African-American men in particular that are beginning to talk about what happened to them. The nature of the conversation does not go to the depth of the implications for their relationship to intimacy and their relationship to their own bodies. I think that's what's coming next. And I think what's coming next is to have that conversation in a way that does not generalize about women, that does not pathologize women. It's a conversation about what happened in that moment when someone found or had a need to intervene in your sovereignty because that was their need, for whatever the reason is, right? I think that's where I think the conversation is going. And I think what we can do is to just like take a step back and to simply ask a question about experience. And I know that Joan Scott has an interesting essay on experience. And I think that we can mobilize that sort of critical inquiry about experience into these conversations about men and sexual abuse.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for your question. Thanks, Tamari. Leroy has his hand up. Leroy, do you want to unmute and you can speak?
Hey, Tamari, how you doing?
Hi, Leroy, how are you?
Hey, I know you discussed this before, but and you know I'm a graduate student. But what do you do when you know you're an older graduate student and you realize that you're coming in with new knowledge and you're breaking new ground, and your department has no no idea on how to advise you, and you know it's just weird. I'm a Black disabled man, you know, older man, and yeah, I've been doing this work for decades and decades, and I see that you know my partner is anthropology, but I see all these departments in graduate school and even in academic alone are so separate. They don't talk to each other. You know, it's like the Black studies don't know what the disability studies are doing, and the anthropology don't know what the Black studies are doing. So, you know, what do you do when you're coming in with new knowledge and you know that your knowledge is needed, but you know, the academic can't really hold you, you know, so yeah.
Thanks for the question, Leroy. Let me say, first of all, that Leroy is a valued contributor to Appealing because he's appalling. He's my co-author on the chapter on Black men and disabilities and sexuality. I think what you're confronting, Leroy, is one of the issues in academia, and scholars have been trying to create space where the silos are broken down through, some have developed institutes of transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary studies, but those are institutes.
Yeah.
And I think you know, there's a valiant effort over the last 15 years or so, 10, 15 years, where scholars are attempting to break out of the silos,
Yeah.
right? If you are in a department as a graduate student where that is not available to you, I think the critical thing is to have a conversation with the supervisor and the supervisory committee about the kind of space that you are attempting to articulate through your work. And if your committee is really about supporting your work, if your supervisor is really about supporting your work, then in that instance, the supervisor and the committee will, I think, exercise the humility to enable you to lead them into rethinking the strict silos and boundaries of academia. because that's a really exciting way of going about your work, but it may also threaten. And I think as we talk about morphic resonance and people coming into themselves, right? I think then that if someone on your committee, your supervisor is threatened by that, I think that's an opportunity to have a conversation about, you know, I need you to help my project. I need you to help me grow. And that will entail that you grow along with me, right? We don't need to all do the same thing. And I think it's about how one has the conversation with one's committee members and one's supervisor, knowing that some supervisors, some committee members simply might not be amenable to that. And it's a tough road to hoe.
No, my community members are really down with me, and they really see that I'm bringing knowledge. It just, it just seems to me it's going my 4th year, and it seems that I'm teaching more than I'm learning. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this is what comes with being the pioneer that's like crisscrossing these boundaries, because in part, you're a whole person, and that to divide yourself by the discipline that you're in does not resonate with your existence. And I think this is, you're at that moment where a lot of us are.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Leroy. Thanks, Tamari. Anyone else have any questions? As I said before, just jump in. If you don't ask one, I'm going to ask one. You know this, don't you? I wanted to go back to your ideas about Black men as erotic property, and I know you outlined some of that with Frantz Fanon and Baldwin's work, which I really appreciated seeing that as well. It's the question of property, which, for, of course, descendants of former enslaved people is quite an emotional word, in fact. And it brings to mind things that we don't necessarily want to think about, the lash, the whip, the plantation. But I wondered what you thought about like Cheryl Harris's work on the white possessive, and how that might maybe impact or influence some of your thinking around erotic property. I particularly wonder about that because of you talking about the sexualization of Black men in the workplace by white women and men, and propositioning and stuff like that. Yeah. And
that's I think that's an interesting question. And I'm familiar with Cheryl Harris's work. On your instigation, I will go back and reread it, because she's talking about whiteness as a site of property that goes beyond the self, because the self becomes property. And I think like one of the key things to recognize when we're talking about property is that property is a right of exclusion, to prevent or exclude someone from either possessing, using something. What if that something is yourself? What if that something is your identity, right? And this is where it's terribly problematic. And you can talk to any Black person, male or female, man or woman, and they will talk about hair and how in particular the white colleagues want to touch their hair or have touched their hair. So there's the sense in which Blackness is about a property status in the cultural imagination of others. And when I say others, I don't mean every single other. It's culturally reproduced, which doesn't mean that every single person buys into that logic. But anyone who wants to reproduce that logic will be rewarded for it. And part of the reward is there'll be no disciplinary actions for it, right? So in that sense, I think Cheryl Harris's idea around whiteness as property is something that I will revisit and flesh that out a bit more to see how that can help me develop the language that I'm after to match that intuitive sense, my heart chakra, my heart sense that there are words that I'm searching for that might have to be composite words built from the work cobbled together from other people's scholarship, but you know, is to open myself up to rereading and rethinking again work that I thought that I had already put in its place. I knew it, I've already read it. This is now inviting me to do that genealogical work again, of going back to see what is there that I can pull forward and excavate. So I want to thank you for tuning me into Cheryl Harris.
Well, I hope it's useful in some kind of way. Curtis has their hand up. Do you want to unmute Curtis and ask your question? Unmute, please. Answer, can you help Curtis to unmute? I don't think they can do it. Can you try? Can you unmute Curtis? I'm trying to get Mansa to help you. If you can't unmute, you can put it in the chat if you're a quick typist. No, I don't think it's working. And we're kind of at the end. And any possibility of you coming on, Curtis? Because we're getting to the end. No. And nothing in the chat. All right. Mansa, could you help Curtis to unmute at all? No?
I tried to, wait, I think there's a new message.
Okay. What's the
Oh, okay.
message?
So
that was me.
Yeah, so yeah, so he said that his question is from all the work he has been doing. What suggestions would he impart on us to contribute or encourage this discussion?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's in part about identifying those persons that are amenable and open to the conversation. Because it's really about building relationships. And through that capacity, like even, you know, I mean, like this may sound kind of hokey, right? But there's something in somebody else's body language, a look, a posture, that you can figure out this might be the person where I can have this conversation with. So if like the conversationalist that shared with me being objectified in the workplace as other people's property, touched, propositioned, that if they identify someone in the workplace that can be an ally with them in raising the issue, that's the person to have that conversation with, right? And it's really about identifying who that person is, but that also means being aware of yourself enough to know that how you are being impacted by the tropes. So if someone is being impacted by tropes, right, that they can have that conversation with someone in your office or in another office, or someone in another discipline or field or area of work. It's really quite intimate. And again, it comes back to being conscientious about yourself. Anyone, like not just, you know, anyone has to be conscientious about themselves in order to figure out, right, how these tropes are working out. And it doesn't have to be a Black man. It could be a Black woman, a non-Black woman, a non-Black man in the workforce, right, or the office, who sees something, hears something, and it just doesn't resonate, it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. Very often having the conversation with the Black person to whom it is directed, it might not be the best person to have the conversation with, right? Because they may not be ready, they may not be trusting. So it might be finding another conversation with whom to have the conversation about, hey, you know what, this was said in the office by X and Z person. We don't need to fire that person, but we need to figure out a way to have a conversation with them about the implications of doing those sorts of things in the workforce, in the office, because it's poisoning the work environment for the rest of us, and we might not even know it. So I think it's really about being conscientious about oneself and whoever you are, to be able to be attuned to the implications of when someone is being subjected to erotic impropriety.
So much for that question. And thank you so much for your response, Tamari. We've unfortunately come to the end of our time together. I want to thank you once again for coming to give your talk on your research in progress to Anti-Racism Lab. We truly appreciate you, Tamari, a lot. And I hope you know that. The next in our speaker series is going to be our Indigenous History Month speaker was going to be Isabel Altamirano Jimenez from the Political Sciences Department here at the University of Alberta. What's the date for that, Manza? June what? 5? June 5th, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, June 5th. Manza, as usual, will send out the information and the registration details. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your questions and your interactions with Tamari's thoughts.
Can I just make a request?
Sure.
I'm still inviting conversationalists to the project. So if anyone is interested or know anyone who may be interested to have the conversation, they could just go to my website, tkitossa.ca, and they'd be able to see the project description and get in touch with me if they so feel inclined.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. I'm about to go to bed here on my side of the world. Bye-bye.
Bye.